it is a great honor to be having this conference with two very important researchers, people who are well known all around the world because of their contributions regarding geopolitics, economics from the perspective of the Marx viewpoint, particularly, and well, they have been quite the reference for the discussions here at the faculty and outside the faculty in other spheres for us to reflect upon what's happening right now, to have a political dialogue and a political perspective in our daily lives as well. So I'll first introduce them and then we will pass the floor to each one of them. We have here Dr. Michael Roberts, who is an economist from Britain, Marxist, and he has been in the field for more than 50 years. He's been working as an economic analyst at London City for more than 30 years. He has edited a very important blog. And well, he writes different articles. He's participated in multiple fora. He has published the Long Recession of Marxist View in 2009. And in June 2016, he published the Long Depression, Marxism in the Global Crisis of Capitalism. In the Spanish translation, has been widely shared here in the country. And so we feel very honored, very happy to have Michael Roberts with us. We welcome him back to UNAM. And also we have with us Dr. Claudio Katz, an economist as well. He has been a professor in economy for historians at the Faculty of Philosophy and Literature and Social Sciences of the Buenos Aires University. He is also a teacher and a researcher. He's participated actively in different social fora for the intervention, for the shared reflections of social practices and social critique. And he is one of the pillars in Latin American debate on the theory of dependence. And he's also an expert in imperialism. So with us to moderate, we have Alejandro Alvarez right next to me. He is in the auditorium, but tomorrow, I forgot my dyslexic brain, Daniel Mendoza Pichardo. Anyway, so tomorrow he will also be participating with Javier Arrazabalo Montoro in another table, another very valuable contribution. So without further ado, we pass the floor to the guests. And apologies once again for the technical difficulties. We have very low Wi-Fi signal. So but we will start with Robert. Let's hope the interpretation works well. Hello, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, perhaps in London. Let us begin. We'll ask Michael Roberts, who, well, I know we all know who he is. We have benefited so much from his blog and his writings. So without further ado, we pass the floor to Michael Roberts. Welcome.
Can you hear that better?
Yeah, that's better.
That's better. Well, good. So I've got the subject and the theme today is about the limits of capital and the development taking place on the world economy between the decline that's taking place relatively in the West, or if you want to call it the global North, and what that's meaning for the rest of the world, whether there's a shift in economic and political power towards other parts of the world, particularly the East. And so I want to bring out what is happening to world capitalist economy at the moment and how that follows from that. In order to do that, I wish to present a number of slides to you. I'm hoping I can share those. I think I can. So if I just, oops. Yep, you can see the slides okay? Good. Okay, so that's the title of the conference session today. And the first graph I want to show you is what is happening with the world economy. This is world real GDP growth. And you can see that we've entered a period since the Great Recession and global financial crash of 2008 of a steady decline in the rate of growth in the world as a whole. So this is an average for the world, so it includes fast-growing countries like China and India. But what it really tells you is that the top G7 economies of the capitalist West have slowed down sharply and have entered what I've called in that book you first mentioned, a long depression, of which they have yet to come out of. So we can see a gradual decline in world real GDP growth. And if I take the position in this country, Mexico itself, we can see a similar development. It's nothing different at all. You can see the ups and downs in annual real GDP growth for Mexico. And if you can just see the faint blocks there, gray blocks there, those are the points where Mexico entered a slump. And there's been quite a few slumps since 1980, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And currently, Mexico's growth rate is virtually zero and is possibly going into recession again. So we have a slowdown in Mexico reflecting the general slowdown. And if you look in the top right-hand corner of this graph, you can see how that's gone over the last few decades. And in particular, in the 2020s, since the pandemic slump, the growth rate in Mexico has now fallen to just 1% on an average annual basis. It's a little higher in 2010 with the commodity boom of oil, but very low in the 2000s as well. So this Mexico's slowdown and stagnation almost is not unusual now across the world. Why is the world economy slowing down? It's mainly due to falling investment growth. My view is that investment is key to growth, not consumption. And the level of investment, particularly level of investment in productive assets, which increase the value produced, is key to developing growth and improving the living standards and incomes of the population involved. Investment to GDP as a ratio has declined in all the major economies since 2007, with the exception of China. And you can see this is China's investment to GDP ratio, up above the 40% ratio, way above the rest of the world. If we take the advanced economies, you can see that red line down. It's very low, down below 23% now, where it used to be closer to 28. And the same applies to the other parts of the world too. The emerging markets, excluding China, have generally also declined down to about the same rate of investment into GDP as the advanced economies. Only when you include China does the world look a lot higher. So we have a significant decline, something like 10% in the investment to GDP ratio in all the major economies in the 21st century. Why is this? Well, Marx would have explained it clearly. I think he would say that there's a general tendency for the rate of profit on capital to fall over time in the major economies of the world, but in the capitalist economies. And in this graph, I just look at the top 7 economies in the world called the G7, excluding those like China, India, and so on. These are the advanced capitalist economies. We might call them the imperialist core in the world at the moment. And you can see that over a period since 1950, there's been a general downturn in the rate of profit. Not in a straight line. There have been periods when it has risen. It's very high in the 50s and 60s, the so-called golden age, a big drop down to the 1980 through the period of big decline in the profit rate. Then the neoliberal recovery, which was relatively powerful enough to raise the rate of profit to some extent in the G7. But since really the end of the 20th century, we've seen a significant decline in the rate of profit in the major economies of the imperialist North. Only the pandemic slump of 2020 has actually given a bit of a boost, but it's still well below levels we saw in the 60s and 70s and even in the 90s. And that has meant an increasing struggle to get extra profit around the world, increased competition between countries to raise exports, to boost investment abroad to get extra profit. And that has led, particularly since the end of the global financial crash and the Great Recession, to actually a slowdown now in the expansion of what used to be called globalization, the expansion of trade relative to GDP across the world, which benefited many countries, but also benefited the richer countries more than the poorer countries, but everybody to some extent. Now that has flattened out. We have the trade as a percentage of GDP is flattened out completely since the Great Recession and continues to do so. And the forecast, at least by the IMF and World Bank, is for that process to continue to the end of this decade. So we have the end of globalization and the fragmentation of trade. And part of that process, as we can see, is the decline relatively of the US economy in the world, as reflected in the US dollar index. That's the measurement or the value of the US dollar against other currencies and other trading countries around the world. And you can see there's been a relative decline since the dollar became separated from the gold standard in the 1970s. There have been ups and downs, but generally the decline is there, something like a 20% decline in the value of the dollar against other currencies and against gold even more. But the dollar is still the major currency of world reserves and finance, as I'll show in a minute. But you can see that effect upon the dollar is also a reflection of the relative decline of the global north, the imperialist core countries around the world. And what we've had is the beginnings of a rise in other countries' share in the world of world GDP, in particular China. We talk about the BRICS, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now expanded this group to include other countries. But within the BRICS, China now accounts for 17.5% of global GDP, by far the biggest amount, followed by India at 7%, and the other countries within the BRICS group relatively small, who just make up 6%. But you can see now that the BRICS total share in world GDP has passed the G7 total in world GDP. So we're beginning to see a change in the relative weight and dominance, at least in terms of GDP, between countries outside of the global north, the imperialist core, and they are beginning to, if they were combined together, have a stronger position in the world GDP. But we have to remember that when we look at GDP per person or per income per person, the BRICS nations are still way, way behind the G7 economies. Here you can see the blue blocks. Those are the G7 economies. That's their GDP per capita in international dollars. And you can see, starting with the US at around about $80,000 per person, we go down to Japan at $50,000, way ahead of the BRICS countries, including even if Russia, China, and so on, they are way behind. So even though the BRICS has now a bigger GDP as share than the G7, it doesn't have that position when it comes to the question of GDP per head, and which you'll see in other factors as well. So in effect, the BRICS is still a weak force relative to G7 when it comes down to prosperity and incomes for the populations that they represent. Will the BRICS be able to close the gap and therefore change the position of the global north or the west relative to the global south, or if you like, those countries outside the imperialist core? Now, I've projected the current per capita growth rates that we've seen over the last 16 years, from 2007 to 23, for these various groups, the BRICS and the high-income countries. And you will, if you project that forward, you will see that none of the BRICS will catch up to the current high-income country level in the next 20 years. Next 20 years, except for China. None of them will. You see, most of the BRICS will still be way, way behind the position of the high-income economies, which is the blue line here, and they will not be closing that gap at all. Only China will do that. It could possibly do that if the current per income growth rates continue. It will achieve that by in the middle of the 2040s, and it would begin to overtake the position of the G7, the top countries, the high-income countries, after that date. But that's still some 20 years away. So the idea that the BRICS in some way is going to become a powerful alternative force to the G7 imperialist economies has to be questioned when you look at this projection. And as the World Bank has said recently, the per capita GDP of the high-income economies have recovered or will have recovered by 2027 to where it was before the COVID pandemic slump of 2020. But the developing countries, the vast majority of them, will still be below where they were in 2020, except for China. It could take these other economies, the developing economies, about 2 decades to recover the economic loss of the 2020s. So, in other words, far from the poorest countries making any progress in improving the living standards for these most populated places in the world, these countries are still dropping further behind as poverty rates rise. Why won't they catch up? Well, in my view, there are 2 explanations to this. The Marxist explanation can be divided into 2. First, there are massive transfers of value from the global south, from the BRICS countries in particular, but also the developing countries in general, from the global south to the global north through trade, through transfers of income, through investments, and through the transfers of capital as well. So that's huge transfer that's taken place and continues to take place, reduces the ability of the global south economies, including the BRICS countries, to really catch up in any way. And the other reason is that profitability is falling across the world in the major capitalist economies, but it's falling faster in the global south economies. Therefore, that reduces the ability for the capitalists in the global south to accumulate capital and invest, and lowers the ability, therefore, to increase labor productivity and per capita income. That relative disadvantage for the global south economies makes it impossible for them to catch up. Here is an important point to make that. Here is the imperialist bloc rate of profit, which is the dotted blue line, which you go back to the 1950s. Afterwards, I can give you sources on this, but you can see there's a general decline, as we've seen before in the original graph for the G7. But here is the dominated bloc, as it's called here, or the peripheral economies of the global south, and they have a higher rate of profit. Why? Because their level of investment in technology, in constant capital, in the organic composition of capital is therefore lower, and they have more people spent on labor than relative to technology than the advanced economies. But as they expanded and introduced the new technologies, their rate of profit has fallen much faster. And that means that there is a tendency for them to stop investing as if their profitability rate falls even faster. Here's Mexico and the US compared. You can see the US rate of profit is much lower, was and still much lower, around about 8% in this particular measurement, and hasn't really changed much, slightly up and then slightly down again. But look how quickly the internal rate of return in this case has fallen in Mexico over the last 70 years. That's an indication of this convergence, which makes it difficult for the global south to really expand and catch up. And then, as I said, massive value transfers from the global south to the global north. A latest book out by Ishikawa and Mokre actually analysed how much that's worth from the period 1990 to 2020, and they come up with a cumulative figure of $70 trillion have been transferred from the global south countries economies through trade and value transfer to the global north. That's some 6% of the annual global output in the productive sectors of the economy. A massive transfer, which of course weakens the abilities of the capitalist forces, companies and sectors in the global south to expand and catch up. And on the right-hand graph, you can see that I've looked at the income flows which have taken place. This is the same as trade. This is the income flows from interest, profits, and transfers of funds over the past 8 years, just the past 8 years. As a percentage of GDP, you can see that Japan has been taking a huge inflow from the assets that it's developed and invested over the broader G7 as a whole, gets 1% of GDP per year during this period. And all the BRICS countries, there's the BRICS countries, less than, but nearly 1% of GDP disappears every year in primary income flows from the south to the north. Countries like Brazil, very heavily, even more than that. I haven't got Mexico on this, but I can tell you that it's just as bad as Brazil. In fact, Mexico, Indonesia, Russia, South Korea, and Brazil are the largest givers of value on the basis of this transfers and income flows. And at the same time, we have a huge rise in global debt because with profitability falling, there's a tendency to increase the amount of debt. If you're not making gains on your trade and on your investments, then debt will rise because companies will take out more debt to try and compensate. Governments will take out more debt to try and handle their own services and so on. And we're seeing a big rise. Yes, it's in the advanced capitalist north as well, but the emerging markets are now accounting for an increasingly larger amount of the global debt that's risen now to something like over $350 trillion as of the latest figures. And of that, now about 1/3 nearly is accounted for within the emerging markets. Investment is what matters, as I said before, and the level of productive investment in the economy is key. China's investment to GDP, as we saw, was double that of the US and more than double that of Brazil. And China's investment to GDP ratio has risen 20% since the 1990s, while Japan's has fallen 20% and Brazil's by 11%. You can see here, there's China's on the purple line, the latest figures in the 2020s. It's still very, very high. India's is relatively high, but when we get down to countries like Brazil, it's fallen and it's very low, and it's lower even than the United States. So while that happens, it's almost impossible to expect an expansion of the economy and the closing of the gap with the North. So my key conclusions on this particular session, haven't got much further to go, is that the countries of the global south, around 6 billion people, are not catching up with the countries of the global north that have 2 billion people. The main reason is that wealth and value is being persistently transferred from the south to the north, and profitability in the global south is falling faster than labor productivity growth is rising in the global south. China may be the exception here because its investment growth is less determined by profitability than any other major global south economy. And now, what is making the situation worse now is the attempt of US imperialism in particular to bring about an improvement in its position at the expense of the rest of the world. And of course, we know now a lot about President Trump's proposed plan to make America great again by basically introducing massively increased tariffs on imports into the US and to retaliate against anybody who stands in their way. So we have an effective tariff rate now on all imports into the US of around 70%, where it was less than 3% before Trump came into office. That's a massive increase, the highest level we haven't seen since for 90 years. And that is squeezing the ability of other countries to export, at least to the United States. And there's increasingly attempts now by America to stop exports going to other countries like Mexico as a roundabout way of getting into the US, precisely to stop the process of trade for other countries. And at the same time, the US continues to maintain its financial superiority in the major parts of global capital. Here is the share of global assets by country, financial assets, and the Blue line is the US dollar, which has declined a little, but still something like 40% of all global assets are held in dollars. The euro has a relatively high figure, but that's only between euro countries. If you look between non-euro countries and euro, then the euro is a much weaker share of total assets. All the other currencies are not really important when it comes to controlling the financial assets around the world. Everything is really still held mainly in the US dollar, despite its relative decline. So in summary, I would say, do we see a shift from the West, given its decline, given the decline in the relative decline in the US economy, the falling rate of profit, the fall in investment, the slowing up of growth in the West and internationally? Do we see a shift, therefore, to the East, which is going to make a big difference over the next decade or so? Are the BRICS really an anti-imperialist force? Well, I just don't need to spell it out. You can look down this list and you can ask yourself, do these countries represent a progressive force to change the way things are imperialism? India under Modi, Russia under Putin, Brazil under Lula, I leave you to discuss that one, China under Xi, South Africa under Ramaphosa, Argentina under Milei, Saudi Arabia under MBS, Iran under the Ayatollah. Are these anti-imperialist forces? I think not. So I will finish on the most important thing. If BRICS are not going to turn things around or shift the forces of progressive capitalism from the West to the East, how can capitalism get out of the decline? Is capitalism reached the limits of capitalist progression? I think the answer to this is threefold. First, what Marx said in understanding the process of capitalism is that capitalism can only develop and grow and expand if it gets profitable gains on the capital investments it makes. If profitability is falling, that means the only way it can restore profitability, capital, is to destroy the value of old capital, which is no longer productive, get rid of weaker sectors of the economy, get rid of old technology and capital, reduce the labor force. In other words, cut the costs of capital so that the profitability of those who are left after that destruction have a higher rate of profit and can begin the process of increasing investment again. This is the process of boom and slump. This is the process of what you might call creative destruction. That hasn't happened properly. As we saw, profitability is still low in the major economies, and it hasn't been sufficient yet, a process of slump and creative destruction to turn that around. So just imagine the size of a slump that will be necessary to bring about a change in that situation. But until you get that, then the possibility of developing robots and artificial intelligence, which is now supposedly the savior of capitalism in the West, with these big, magnificent 7 companies who are investing huge billions of dollars into artificial intelligence and to the digital economy. Can this really transform the capitalist economies and open up a new period of growth? I don't think so, unless the profitability is restored to do so. So the artificial intelligence process, which may come about, depends also on the ability to improve profitability, therefore to employ artificial intelligence and other investments effectively, that they can raise the productivity of labor. If none of those things happen, I think we're in for a real danger that we could move to the position as we had in the 1930s, that we could have a new lease of life for capitalism only after a major war or a defeat of revolutions, if you like. If we look at the history of capitalism in the last 200 years, it's been after major wars that we see a new lease of life for capitalism, because physically, old capital is destroyed and replaced by the ability to employ new capital and employ cheap labor. Those are the options ahead of us. Either nothing happens, we stay as we are, we have a creative destruction and slump, which allows profitability to rise and a technological revolution, or the real dangers of a war. I don't think it looks good for the AI solution at the moment. This is a quick graph from the OECD, which shows how long it takes to introduce a new technology to spread across the whole economy. In the case of a PC, it takes about 20 years, from 1980s up until the end of the 20th century. In case of electric power, going further back into the early part of the 20th century, it took a similar time. So AI, which only has diffusion amongst companies now of around about 5%, it could take another 20 years before that becomes fully usable, assuming it's effective. So we're talking about 2044 before AI can really play a role in the major economies. We shall see. Maybe it'll come quicker. But that's the implication from this particular graph. So the alternative to capitalism is to rearm. Maybe we should move, they will think, towards higher military expenditure to boost the economy that way, and also perhaps prepare for a war which will settle the issue for those in charge of the world economy at the moment. Rearmament has begun. NATO wants to increase the investment in military activity to 5% of GDP from the current 2%. It's already under the way to going to 3%. Of course, that's way below where it was after the Second World War, and after the end of the Cold War and the peace dividend. But it's on its way. And that's an indication of the direction, a dangerous direction that capitalism could see as its way out of the limits of capital now. I finish on this last graph, everybody. This is a graph which I think explains what the alternative is. If you look at this, this is going back to the G7 economies, and you can see that the G7 economies invest between 20 and 25% of GDP in investment. But what is the majority of that investment? In which sector? It's in the capitalist sector, in the business sector. So if the government share of total investment in GDP is tiny, 2 or 3% of GDP. And as you can see, the G7 average, 20%, less than 5% is going in public investment. The way forward for us as socialists, and as far as I'm concerned, for working people, is to reverse that diagram so that 75 to 80% of investment is conducted by the government in the direction of social need and in productive investment, and we reduce the role and share of a capitalist sector to a much smaller and tiny part of the process. If that was to happen, then it would be a completely different position in expanding the economy, and the global south and the east will begin to catch up with the global north.
Thank you, Michael. That was an excellent presentation. Shocking, excellent. It has placed the important things center stage, the big problems that the international economy is now facing. So we will now pass the floor to Professor Katz so that he can continue the discussion. Professor Katz, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Once again, thank you for having invited me. It is a great pleasure for me to participate in this colloquium to jointly analyze the role of Latin America vis-a-vis the imperial system, because it is very often to say that the Latin American region is irrelevant, that it has no gravity, that it plays no role in the global disputes. That's what you hear all the time here. And that is why Trump says that the US doesn't need Latin America and can do without the whole of Latin America. And this perspective that you hear so frequently, they're mistaken, I think, because they don't see the trend that is providing order to the global scenario, which is the economic decline of the US, and their trend to counteract that drop with geopolitical aggressions, with wars, interventions, so as to keep their global hegemony. So if we consider this concept as an ordering concept, Latin America is actually very important for the US. And it is important because this economic decline in the US, it's a phenomenon that is well known by all the analysts. The US during the last few decades has been the epicenter of financial crisis, which reflected an economy that was affected by a declining productivity. And Trump has recreated protectionism and is running away from free trade agreements in which the U.S. would lose vis-a-vis China. But the growth of China is something that all analysts have also acknowledged. In my opinion, it has to do with the fact that their economic model is based on the triple pillar of socialism, mercantile complements, and capitalist parameters, which are combined. China has reinvested their surplus through a model that doesn't need neoliberalism or financing. And even though they created a capitalist class, that class doesn't have the control of the state, but rather the state is handled by a bureaucracy, which very efficiently deploys the powers of this new growth. And because of this, the crisis of neoliberal capitalism are affecting more seriously the US than China. And there are numerous indicators that prove that. So the North American strategy has as a priority to contain China first. And in this idea of let's try to contain, keep away China, Latin America is not irrelevant at all, but on the contrary, it is quite evident that the US needs Latin America more than ever now to try to recover their world dominance, because in the Trump campaign to favor American capitalists through tariffs and sanctions and blackmailing the rest of the world, Latin America has to give the US all of their natural resources. The US wants to take over the enormous mineral, energy, food, wealth of a region to use them in their chain of value and to make a profit from the proximity of those resources. And if he wants to do that, the US priority is to displace China, to kick China out of Latin America, kick them out. The Silk Route, which in our region has amounted to 21 of the 33 countries. China is currently investing in electric cars in Brazil. It is managing the most important South American port. It is financing the most important infrastructure works, while the US is threatening and sanctioning. So in the face of this, to reverse the adversity, which means the enormous penetration that China had in the last 20 years in Latin America, Trump has started a process of recolonizing Latin America, which started by the imposition in Panama, the freezing of all the exchanges with China, and now with Argentina. In exchange of a financial rescue, they are requesting the total displacement of China out of the country. Argentina is at the edge of bankruptcy, economic collapse. Trump has offered support to Argentina to avoid the Milei crumbling down, to rescue investment funds from the US that they bought Argentinian bonds, but also this has been an effort to kick China out of Argentina so that Argentina could substitute a monetary support that Johannes has for dollars in the Federal Reserve. And in this case, Argentina can pay off all of the technology contracts, the dam and nuclear energy contracts Argentina has, so that Argentina gives uranium, rare earths, and all the resources Trump wants and bends to the demands of the US, who wants to take over Argentinian companies. So I would say that all of the announcement given by Trump at the beginning of his administration of buying Greenland and annexing Canada and Panama, well, they started with the hijacking of Argentina, which is currently undergoing a very difficult situation. And this hijacking of Argentina by the US is just the beginning for a recolonization of the whole region. And a process of this nature would lead for Latin America to be even for more plundering, for more income transfers, of dependent capitalism to grow, for more resources to be stolen away. There will be an extension of the gap in the region vis-a-vis the developed economies, and it would make things more difficult after several decades of neoliberal economies. So extractivism in industry policies and external debt would be increasing, which is our worst nightmare. So it is quite evident that the US is trying to take over the Latin American natural resources to displace China and to compensate their decline. The second situation is geopolitical. I believe that the very aggressive nature of Trump has some very deep geopolitical repercussions because it is reshaping world alliances, and realignments are taking place. For instance, Russia has been pushed to defend against sanctions by moving away from Europe and aligning itself with China. The same thing is happening with China, India, and even with some European partners. And from the Arab world, there is a US pressure that is imposing the creation of alliances, blocs, and enemies that are separating the world. And that is why between the global north and the global south, this divide is growing, and perhaps it is more geopolitically loaded now than economic in nature. On the one hand, the global north, Western capitalism is acting through NATO against the global south, which is a very heterogeneous group that has some military powers, economic powers as Russia and China, with intermediate players like India or Brazil, and many periphery countries. But what do the players have in common in the global south? All of them are suffering from the imperialistic attacks of the US, and because of this aggression, there's also a reinforcement of the multipolarity. There's a reinforcement of that dispersion of the global power, which is eroding the supremacy that the US used to exert. And I believe that is because of this reason that there's been an increase of BRICS to gravitate together. In the beginning, they were always only trying to do an integration. They couldn't because of the fractures of globalization. In the beginning, they attempted to reformulate international organizations. They were rejected. And so they embarked in the creation of their own institutions. And the BRICS ended up creating a coalition, a defensive coalition vis-a-vis the offensive of the US. They ended up creating a contention bloc that is trying to compensate the destructive strength of the US and NATO. So in this dispute, Latin America is once again important because the US is trying to prevent the consolidation of the BRICS in our region. On the first hand, because that consolidation would extend the autonomy margins. Let us not forget that Brazil has kept a state policy of continuity with the BRICS, with Bolsonaro and with Lula. Brazil is sharing the de-dollarization projects of the BRICS that Trump is so much rejecting, because in order for the recolonization of Latin America to take place, the US needs to preserve the kingdom of dollars in the region. Dollarization is the most radical mechanism that the US has to control the region. There's dollarization in Panama, in El Salvador, in Ecuador, and in small or middle-sized countries like Argentina. Trump is also trying to prevent the entrance of Mexico to the BRICS because there is a policy of exerting pressure over Mexico by using tariffs as instruments to benefit US companies. It blames Mexico for many things, and crises that were actually created by US companies at the border. The US wants to introduce changes in the free trade agreement, the USMCA, to block the entrance of European products or Chinese products through Mexico to the US. And also the US, what Trump wants is for everyone to repeat the suicide Argentina has gone through. Argentina gave up being part of the BRICS, and this decision will be historical as an example of a self-suicide, because with the BRICS, Argentina could have gotten a grain agreement with Russia. It could have consolidated exports to China. Argentina could have diversified their businesses in every field. Argentina had the opportunity of becoming a member of financial markets that could provide oxygen for them to handle their debt, but they committed suicide because they aligned with the US, they changed to the monetary fund, they became subordinate to the US Treasury Department, and because of all of that, there's been a deterioration of the structures of Argentina, and the path of Argentine deterioration is the one that the US is wanting all Latin America to go through to get us to be subservient all throughout the region and use this as a way in which they can recover global power. This leads us to the third point, which is the military implications of the imperialistic offensive of the US. As we have seen in the Middle East, the US is causing invasions, occupations to counteract their economic decline. And they have waged wars in Afghanistan, then Iraq, Libya. They have led Syria, Lebanon. They're also threatening Iran. And the US in the East, in the Arab world, created a very destructive catastrophe that has killed countries, has destroyed societies, and everything was done to preserve, to militarize the world, and to try to keep their global hegemony. And the most extreme trend of this is what Israel has done and is doing with the scale of military brutality never seen before, the genocide, the state terrorism, by breaking all traditional laws in terms of the proportionality of retaliation, killing leaders and diplomats, journalists, as a mobster. But Israel is not alone. Israel is but an instrument of the US strategy for reshaping all Middle East. In the same way, just as the US has militarized Europe against Russia in a symphony with all of their projects, they're doing this to have a free hand, and so as to be able to tamper with Asia and the pressure against China. So the US has a strategy of recovering from the military and geopolitical perspectives what they're losing in the economic world. And in this sense, Latin America is a field of priority for them because they believe that our region is their backyard and they cannot dispute world supremacy without exhibiting full dominance of our continent. And that is why they're once again applying the Monroe Routine doctrine. That's why they are still having so explicit imperialistic discourses by openly stating that the US must be in charge of the Venezuelan oil supplies. It is quite evident that Venezuela is now the most important card of the US for the region, and it's not only because of the oil. The US needs to control Venezuela so as to create a subordination access all throughout the region to destroy UNASUR, ECLAC, ALBA, and all of the organizations. And that is why they are militarily provoking in the Caribbean Sea, attacking fishermen with the excuse of drug dealing activities. The U.S. is behind the nomination of Corina Machado to the Nobel Peace Prize, because Corina Machado is quite the antithesis of peace. And Venezuela has to be, Venezuela should bend the knee, because for the U.S., Venezuela is a problem that has to be surpassed for that. And they'll try to do what they have done in Iraq, Syria, Iran, and that's why the current campaign of demonizing the president, demonizing Maduro, just as they did with Assad, Gaddafi, Hussein. And so the aggressions against Venezuela are escalating to try to break such an important stronghold that is in the way of them becoming the owners of the region. So if you consider all of those variants, the economic, the geopolitical, the military ones, if you do consider all of those processes and all of those trends, it seems to me that we need to consider whether the concept of imperialism that we handle is still applicable, because we speak about transition, the hegemonic transition. We speak a lot about the crisis of neoliberal capitalism and multipolarity and of global south, but we don't speak of imperialism enough. And I believe that that is the key in the current period, because that is the concept that better reflects the aggressiveness of the system commanded by the US to recover the global hegemony by expropriating the periphery. Because current imperialism is one that is more aggressive than in the past. The US in the past used to have supremacy over the Soviet Union, but now they are losing economic power vis-a-vis China, and that is why they have to use the military resources in an increasing way. That's why it's becoming more aggressive than in the post-war time, because the economic power has been diluted and what's left is just the military power. And also it's because they are creating a chaos capitalism model. The US is acting, tampering, destroying, but they are not capable of obtaining the results they want. They go break down societies, but that doesn't give them their power back. They have destroyed Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, but their domination has not increased, because with each intervention, it's like a boomerang against their own actions, and it is deepening the conflicts that the US has created themselves. And it is because of this dynamic that we see what we're seeing in Latin America right now. The US is going back to the old coup d'etats sponsored by them, the old direct investment with hybrid operations of destabilization of the governments, of the regimes, of the governments that do not bend to their will, creating a very problematic scenario all throughout the region of increasing conflict and the devastation of the land, an increase of the tensions all throughout the area. And in order for this to take place, the US needs the presidents and the leaders of the far right for their imperialist policies to justify. That's why they need Bukele, Noboa, Milei, Peña, Bolsonaro, all of those characters who have no economic project on their own, but rather their only goal is to act alongside the US to dilute the effects of popular rebellions and to vary the first progressive cycle and to frustrate the second attempt of one that could get results that have not yet been defined. Anyway, I would like to conclude by saying that it seems to me that we are facing a scenario that is dominated by imperial actions. Latin America is once again a pawn, a key piece for the US strategies of compensating their economic decline through military actions, through geopolitical interventions all throughout the planet, particularly in our region. And that is why the discussion of an alternative in Latin America is an important debate. It is one that cannot be delayed any further. And in my opinion, it should always take place considering three strategic pillars. The first one of them should be resisting the US domination, because this is the battle we cannot lose. We cannot have projects for our regions to survive and thrive without conquering our political sovereignty that imperialism is threatening. Secondly, we need to act as a bloc, as a region, in a renegotiation, an economic renegotiation, is a smart one, with China, so as to overcome the primarization, the absence of technology transference, the lack of investment in non-priority areas. We need to renegotiate differently with our main external customers, and China plays an important role in this. And thirdly, we need to move forward in a Latin American unity. That is the only way in which our fragile states and the periphery states will be able to have a say, and for us to kick off economic projects that can be popular, that can be centered in energy sovereignty, financial sovereignty, food sovereignty, and in the very important redistribution of the income that has been so delayed. Therefore, those are the projects that have to be discussed amongst ourselves. For events like this one, this is the reflection that I bring to the table. And that is why I once again take advantage of this few minutes to thank once again UNAM for having invited me. And I hope that with the contributions that we have brought, we can get some useful ideas for our debates. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Katz. Well, I think that between the two presenters, they have complemented one another in their perspectives. Michael has spoken first about what's happening in the global order, and then Claudio has presented the specific problems of Latin America. Perhaps we are the last link we could perhaps do without the US. There's so many things to discuss. The problems of the decline of the US economy, the role of Latin America. So let us now have our audience ask questions so that the speakers can answer the questions that the people here can have. Is Michael being translated to? Okay, so wonderful. Would anybody like to ask a question to any of our speakers? They're going to pass a microphone to you. 1 second, please. Hello, good afternoon. It was so interesting that both of us speakers have a similar political positioning. Michael and Roberts has told us that perhaps an alternative in this fight of blocks, of bricks against the imperialistic bloc, perhaps could be by strengthening the public interest above the private interest. And what Professor Katz has given us, the alternative he's given us, is that we need to strengthen food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and the distribution of income So they're similar, I guess. And there's another similarity that I see. Michael Roberts has said that there is a struggle between the emerging ones, like the BRICS, and the imperialist bloc. Katz similarly has told us that little is said, or rather, the restructuring of capitalism is discussed at the world level, but not enough of imperialism. We speak of capitalism, but not about imperialism. So I guess what I would like to analyze is the nature of the Chinese economy. And it is precisely because of this. During the previous conference here in this colloquium at the Ho Chi Minh Room, there was a presentation on the Bangladesh textile industry and the relationship with China. And they spoke about technology as key, but there was something important. The tremendous exploitation of the labor force in both countries is undeniable. And if there's capitalist exploitation in those two countries, we must conclude then that those economies, they're also capitalists. So it's also very interesting for me to see that in the tables that will take place today and tomorrow, there are some very important presentations in which the question is, what is the neoliberal role of the Chinese economy? I want to attend that conference to see what they argue so that we can have more elements for the discussion. But I would like to ask a question to Professor Katz directly. The strategy of the US is to recover Latin America. He said so himself, and to kick out, displace the presence of China and to keep China at bay. So my question is, in this strategy, what is the role Mexico should play? Because it seems to me that we are subordinated to the US will, especially considering the tariffs that have been imposed on China. So that's my specific question for Katz. Thank you very much. I'll ask you to be more succinct, because if not, it's like a presentation instead of a question, and we need to give our speakers time to answer. So be brief. Hello, good afternoon. My question is for Michael Roberts. He spoke about 3 things that could perhaps be a way out for this time of stagnation of global capitalism. He spoke about the destruction of the capital value that is no longer productive. So my question would be, do you see a mechanism for this to happen in the developed nations, for this destruction of capital to take place, the non-productive capital? Is that happening? Where do you see it? And if you do you see perhaps an industrial revolution now? Because as you said, because automation and AI will take time, but could that be the way out? Or how do you conceive the destruction of capital? So that's the question for Dr. Roberts. Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. The first question for me is for Michael Roberts. It's also about the 2 trends to solve the crisis. He spoke about innovation in technology, and also wars. So the question is, I have read your texts. I remember the Scissors of Recession, in which you spoke of the important role of debt in American society. So from within the US, things are also happening. What is the perspective in which neither war nor innovation are not being effective, because apparently the US is not going to win the war in Ukraine? And it seems to me that there's also a problem with AI as well, the financial bubble and things. So in a scenario of limitations, what is the perspective for the US? And my second question is for Katz. Well, you mentioned that there is a task in renewing or this new concept of imperialism. So my question would be to you, what is the new Trump imperialism for Latin America in the configuration of a drug state? Remember that Petro said that he's the leader of drug dealers. Is that a new configuration, or how would you interpret what happened yesterday in your scenario? All right. Any other questions, or do we let them answer? Well, I have a question regarding the US hegemony. Something that is very striking to me is this idea that there is still a financial hegemony in the sense that the dollar is still the strongest coin, the hegemonic currency. My question is, what about other elements of hegemony? Because they have lost hegemony in the industrial sector, they have lost power in their leadership. Even their military speaking, they're not as strong as they used to be, right? So this financial hegemony of the dollar, how much can it stand in the situation in which the rest of the hegemonic powers are being lost drastically? Oh, there's another question. One last question, and we let them answer. The speakers have spoken about the world situation. And what Katz spoke about imperialism, the US imperialism, sounds right. But about China, we'll have to discuss that further. It's not as easy to say that China is a neoliberal economy. We have to go beyond or deeper. In my opinion, it is a planned economy with a very strong intervention of the state and with a long-term vision that has been very successful for them. And now, Mr. Roberts also spoke about the public sector, public investment. In the case of China, I mean, we have a professor here who's an expert that says that 45% of the GDP comes from the public sector in China. So, could you give us more elements for us to understand this other bloc that is being created with China and the BRICS in this perspective? All right, someone else wants to ask another question. They're adding up. Yes, go ahead. Ask your question. Hello. I agree when Claudio Katz says that what we need now is to speak about imperialism to fully understand the global situation in the sense of discussing alternatives. Should we also speak about anti-imperialism as part of the projects that we need to support? And in this case, should we speak about imperialism and anti-imperialism? What about the national bourgeoisie? Because it's no longer the 70s. The elites in our countries, they are very well subordinated to the US, for instance, in Mexico. So what is the role that this anti-imperialism movement should have regarding the national elites or bourgeoisies? How do we understand now the bourgeoisies? Because China, Claudio Katz spoke about we should go ask for China support. Well, let me remind you that China is a power and they have accumulation desires as the US has them. And the relationship the US has with Latin America right now are reprimarization ones. China has reprimarized Latin America. They're using us just as the US has used us or wants to use us to extract mineral resources from us, to exchange goods, primary goods particularly. So in Latin America, we are facing US imperialistic pressures, but there's also social imperialism from China. And if you don't see that, you are not seeing the economic relationship we have. It is problematic. So Claudio Katz, what's going on there with China? Because China wants the same thing through other more peaceful means, if you may, but China also wants our minerals for their industries. So what do we do about that? Thank you. Thank you. We don't have time for more questions because we're supposed to conclude at 1:30. So we're going to ask Claudio Katz for some final remarks, and we'll then let Michael speak. Claudio. Well, as all of you have said, yes, there are many similarities between what Michael has said and what I have said. I see that there are two things that are common: the analysis of the capitalistic crisis nowadays and the idea of a south to north transference through different devices for that purpose. There's a question about Mexico that I was asked, and yes, I agree. The US has the strategy of recolonizing the whole region. And about Mexico, there is a very strong pressure in the negotiation, the constant renegotiation of the tariffs, with the objective of preventing Mexico from acting with autonomy, economic or geopolitical autonomy. Particularly, the US wants Mexico not to join the BRICS. The US is blocking that, because if Mexico joined the BRICS, Mexico perhaps would have more geopolitical wiggle room. And through the tariffs, the US is trying to prevent the entrance of Chinese products through different paths to the US market. And for that, they are remodeling or seeking to remodel the free trade agreement, the USMCA. So for each important country in the region, for each key country in the region, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, the US has a specific plan, policy. To each one of them, with each one of them, they're aiming, specifically, Mexico wants to be surrounded so that it doesn't surpass the limits. Argentina has to be completely bent, and Brazil, it's all about neutralizing Brazil. Now, another subject that has to be discussed is the relevance that I see, and I believe that many of the participants have seen, the concept of imperialism. This relevance comes from Trump's discourse, the way in which Trump is currently exposing the interests that the US has, as those are imperialistic, very explicit discourses. Imperialism is something that is seen in the facts. It's been reintroduced into the discourse from the perspective of Trump in current geopolitics in a very blatant way. So it seems to me that here we need to establish a difference with China. And I guess this is something that was asked to me, and it's part of the debate. There are many questions about China. I believe that there are things that can be discussed. Other things, we need to be a bit more straightforward. I believe that the degree of capitalist regression, the regression of China into capitalism, is something that has still been discussed. To what extent has capitalism being restored in China? That's something that is still an ongoing debate. There are many elements in favor or against. It's not only about the structure of the economy, but also the structure of the state. But something that cannot be debated is that China doesn't have a neoliberal policy. I mean, it seems to me that China's growth obeys to the fact that they were able to achieve, with a great presence of the state and regulations of the state, they prevented the financing, prevented neoliberalism, and that's what gave them a competitive edge vis-a-vis the US. Now, something that I need to be more forceful, perhaps, in my arguments, I have a more categorical opinion on this, is, in my opinion, China is not imperialistic or social imperialistic, if you may. I see a difference with the US and China. because in my understanding, imperialism is not only economic in nature, imperialism is economic, geopolitical, and military. And I don't see it makes sense for us to characterize China as a military power when it is a power that is not having military interventions anywhere in the world in a significant way. What China is doing is domination, economic domination, which is different. Those two categories are different. Very visible in Latin America. Latin America has been subjected to the imperialistic domination of the US in every single plane. And it's quite evident. The US embassies are tampering with internal policies in our countries all day long, and they defy the coup d'etats that happen, and the powers of the Pentagon, they surround with military bases all the region, and Miami, Washington is where the strategies are defined for the rest of Latin America, a full explicit military intervention. But this is very different from the economic domination that China exerts over Latin America because of the type of treaties, agreements they have established with Latin America. The agreements with China in Latin America, they're harmful for the region, harmful because they're reprimarizing our economies. They see us as only cheap labor or for natural resources. The investments here, what they do, it's not what we need. They are not transferring technology and many things, but this gives rise for an exchange that is unequal, to a transfer of income, to a mere profit. But China doesn't plan coup d'etats in Latin America. China is not doing that, the lawfare. China doesn't displace, is not attacking boats in the Caribbean or blowing out ships. And they're not using the excuse of drug dealing to bring Marines and to get military bases in Peru or Ecuador. So you cannot compare. Those situations are very different. So why does it matter? Why does it matter to make this difference? Because of the strategy that Latin America has to adopt vis-a-vis the US and vis-a-vis China. We can have our own political project in the region. We can have a very solid bloc against the US, anti-imperialism, and I celebrate the term anti-imperialism used by the person from the audience. Yes, just as imperialism is growing strong, our anti-imperialism actions are also growing, and not with an alliance with the elites who have proven endlessly that they rather have an association and not a clash with the US. There is no sign of serious conflict of the capitalist Latin American groups. They're so intertwined with the American capital. So therefore, anti-imperialism is a fight for sovereignty. It's a fight for the defense of our region against the US intervention. So uniting Latin America against US imperialism is key, but Latin America has to be united to negotiate with China differently. Latin America doesn't need a front of political resistance that is military against China. We need to act as a bloc, but instead of discussing every single trade agreement, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Latin America should, at the level of a CLAC, altogether negotiate as a common bloc. That's how all the agreements with China should be renegotiated, so that we could reach agreements that are favorable for the region and that can create some balance after all the happenings with the previous relationships. So that is the difference that I see with China. There's economic domination. With the US, we have geopolitical and military oppression. There you go. Thank you very much, Professor Katz. We will now listen to Michael Roberts. Please, Michael, go ahead.
That the host was keeping me muted, so I could not act. Many questions, not much time, and the chairman will keep an eye on me. First, the economy of the US. what form of this creative destruction could take place? Well, as I said in my presentation, the way in which US capitalism could get a new lease of life and out of the stagnation that it is in is through a major slump, which could raise the profitability of capital for those who survive and then be able to use AI technology and other things. But such a slump has not taken place. Since the Great Recession of 2008-9, now 17 years, we have had a period of stagnation. This has been in some ways deliberate. The capitalist class in America, the political elite, do not want a slump because they fear the political repercussions that would flow from that. So they have been subsidizing and supporting all the weak parts of the capitalist economy in the US to avoid this destruction. And while they continue to do that, then it's not possible for them to bring about a transformation of the level of profitability in the American economy. So we remain in a stagnating environment, both in the US and even worse in Europe and countries like where I come from, like Britain, where stagnation is now permanently fixed in the major economies. That is not going to change until there's a slump and situation which will allow profitability to rise, in my opinion. But it does not seem likely to happen at the moment. And therefore, the options of a new level of profitability, of investment in technology to boost American capitalism and the global north do not appear to be on the horizon yet. So the result is that we will continue with the stagnation and therefore increasingly intense rivalry amongst the imperialist powers, an increased level of military expending in order to try and gain advantage for their profits elsewhere in the world, in the global south. As Claudio has pointed out, this is increasingly an aggressive imperialist period led by the United States, but also supported by its junior partners in Europe and elsewhere around the world. And Latin America is becoming increasingly the area in which this battle is going to be applied. Trump wants complete control of Latin America. For that matter, he wants complete control of North America, Canada as well, in order to create a position where she can then turn his view to dealing with the main enemy over the next 10 years or so, which is China itself. Which brings me to the question of China. There's much debate has been said about what the role of China is in the world at the moment. First, in my view, you can't be described as an imperialist economy like the United States or the other junior partners in the imperialist bloc. Its military is large, but it's not spread around the world. Its economic base is the only way in which it makes contact with the rest of the world through trade and investment. Now, in my opinion, if China is taking the minerals of buying the minerals of Latin America or buying the soybeans of Argentina, that in a process of trade, yes, it gains advantage from that. But the question that Latin America has to face is it has to develop its own independent policy to develop its investment, to diversify its economy. Otherwise, it will remain, as it were, a linkage but to the rest of the world for commodities, for food, for minerals and so on, and not have its own industrial base and technological advancement. That is not going to be possible to achieve under a regime where basically the capitalist classes of Latin America and elsewhere are just completely under the control of the US imperialism. What is the agency for change in Latin America? Is it the leaders of the governments in Latin America? Clearly not. Is it the leaders of the BRICS? Clearly not, in my view. They are not. They may be resisting the role of American imperialism to some extent, but they're not interested in an international development of the world, in particular changing the picture in Latin America. The real agency for change in Latin America has to be the working people of Latin America. Unless they can organize and develop an alternative program for Latin America, Latin American unity, as Claudio said, but also a program for bringing about socialist change in Latin America, then this situation will continue indefinitely. The reason China has grown so fast and so quickly is precisely because the imperialist powers and forces have not been operating in China. The state sector is so large, as a colleague pointed out, that it's been able to preserve an independent role for its expansion of investment and employment. And therefore, though there's still a large capitalist sector in China, it is not dominant. It doesn't run the country. It doesn't operate in the interests of imperialism outside. The Chinese state controls that through a bureaucracy, but it controls it and has an independent strategy and policy. That model, to some extent, is what Latin America needs. It needs public investment, public control, and needs a state in control with working people behind it to transform the economies of Latin America. Unless we get that, Latin America will stay where it is as a pawn to be used by US imperialism, and for that matter, so will other parts of the global south. That's the project which is before us. We have to transform the economic basis of Latin American capitalism into something which resembles a socialist change based on public investment and working class control. Until we get that, this stagnation and this imperialist rivalry and the increasing danger of war lies ahead.
Muchas gracias, Michael. Bueno, pues un aplauso para nuestros ponentes. Creo que fue una magnífica sesión para entrar a los temas de economía política. Y bueno, pues el coloquio sigue. Hay actividades ya ahorita en otro salón. Les pedimos una disculpa a Michael y a Claudio por las dificultades técnicas. Aquí el profesor Sánchez creo que ha subido 10 veces las escaleras de la...
It's normal.
para ir a cambiar las condiciones de las computadoras. Pero bueno, esa fue la condición que tuvimos en esta semana.
Thank you, Flo, for your excellent translation.
Ok, gracias a todos y nos vemos en los siguientes eventos del coloquio. Gracias.
Chao, chao. Hasta la próxima.
También a la traductora.